Hello, I'm delighted to have Dr. Barbara Elias on this week's episode of Conflict and Terrorism Studies with Wisdom. She recently published a paper titled Influence Through Absence in U.S. Counterinsurgency Intervention, Coercing Local Allies Through Threats to withdraw, in the Journal of Civil Wars. Uh, Hello, Barbara. It's a great opportunity to talk with you about your paper today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Wisdom. It's lovely to meet you.
Thank you. You're welcome. So we'll go straight to the first question. We'll like to, our viewers and listeners would like to know exactly what the background of this paper and your research question. What motivated you to write this paper?
Yeah. So the main motivation was listening to lots of different people say lots of different things about what would be the consequences for threatening the US threatening to withdraw from Afghanistan, or US threatening to withdraw from Iraq, for example, that it would motivate local partners to take on more responsibility for the war fighting activities, or would it just abandon an ally and embolden the insurgents? And so we felt like there were two camps, two secure logics, like two kinds of logics that made sense, but there was no evidence for which of these logics actually had more grounding in the empirical record. So we really wanted, it's primarily motivated by that policy question about specifically looking at U.S. interventions. Is the U.S., if they would threaten to withdraw from Afghanistan, for example, would that then create motivation for local allies to take over more responsibility, or would it just embolden the Taliban in the case of Afghanistan, for example? So the research question is essentially just looking at what are the strategic consequences of setting timetables for withdrawal from counterinsurgency interventions vis-a-vis bargaining leverage over local partners. So that was the research question that we looked at, and we looked at the cases of Iraq and Vietnam in particular in thinking about U.S. interventions.
Great. So given this background, what's your core argument in this paper?
Yeah, so this is a co-authored paper. So I wrote it with Alex Weissaker at the University of Pennsylvania in the US. And Alex and I argue in the paper that credible threats of departure, so the U.S., taking steps to say that it's going to withdraw, grounded in U.S. public opinion favoring withdrawal. So if you had like U.S. policymakers saying, the American public is now against this war, we're going to have to pull out, that actually motivated and created bargaining leverage for the U.S. In terms of leveraging or getting its local ally to accomplish certain tasks that the U.S. was pressuring them to take on, but that actual commitments to withdraw. So when the U.S. was actually setting a timetable and saying we're going to withdraw by X date, that did not motivate allies to go along with U.S. pressure any more than not withdrawing.
So what was your methods? What was your empirical approach, or how did you test this argument?
Yeah, so this, like all research, this was the trickiest part, right, is to come up with the data. And we gathered U.S. public opinion data. So it was essentially just looking at U.S. public opinion across time of each of the wars in Vietnam and the wars in Iraq in terms of public support, U.S. public support for the war effort. And then we also gathered data on local ally compliance with U.S. demands in both wars across time. So trying to put these two data sets together about what was U.S. public opinion, and then what was the U.S. asking for from its local partners, and then what was the rate of compliance over time in both interventions. And so we conducted some statistical tests using that data and analyzed the results using a duration model, a statistical model.
Okay, so can you explain more about the statistical data, how you collected it?
Yeah, so the public opinion data, we pulled that from various polls that were available in both Vietnam and Iraq. And then the data that we gathered for local ally compliance with US demands was done through declassified documents in the case of Vietnam. And then it was a mixture in Iraq of both declassified and leaked documents in terms of correspondence of the US delegations asking local allies to conduct certain implement certain policies. So US might ask local partners in Baghdad, for example, to change certain laws or to implement certain policies that they thought would be beneficial for politics in Baghdad. So things like pressuring the Shia regime in Baghdad to engage more seriously with Sunni elements, those kinds of policies. And then we monitored what happened once those policy requests were made. And so we collected that data and created a new data set and then tested exactly how compliance changed over time and if that had if that was correlated in any way with specific points in US announcements about potential withdrawal, as well as changes in US public opinion.
Okay, just still on this method, do you have a link for the data set? Then again, can you explain, maybe a researcher want to also gather data just like this? How did you source this data from the US or from Afghanistan? How were you able to source them, so that for researchers who are interested to have an idea where they can get this from?
Yeah, it's a great thing because the data is the hardest thing to get, right? So I don't think Alex and I have published the data yet, but we would be happy to do so. And essentially how we gathered the data was all using materials that are publicly sourced. And so all of that information about where exactly to find that data is available in the article. And then we also provide several robustness checks that people would be great for others to check and to provide feedback on that. But in terms of the raw data on compliance and on public opinion, we haven't posted that yet, but it's a good reminder to do that because it's really important to have that be publicly available. I'd be happy to share that.
Yeah, so that others can also make use of it and also try to replicate what you have done. Thank you for that. So let's go to your findings. So what did you find? What's your primary findings? What other findings or unexpected findings you were able to find? Yeah.
Well, it's we have several interesting things that we uncovered. It's not simple, right? It's never simple. And obviously, like, the findings were more complicated than I think would fit in a journal. That's why it's also nice to follow up with an interview like this, because you can signal that it's pretty complicated. I mean, as military interventions are. In both Vietnam and Iraq, we found that as US public opinion shifted against each war, that the local ally became more likely to comply with American requests. But by contrast, results for actual withdrawal were weaker. So largely what we were thinking we would find, but there was some contradictory findings between what happened in Iraq and what happened in Vietnam. And that makes a lot of sense, right? These wars are different in lots of really important ways. And so we didn't find the exact same pattern between wars, which is important to highlight. So in short, the evidence suggests that intervening forces will have the most leverage over local partners when they can credibly threaten to withdraw, but have not yet committed to retracting personnel. But I think a lot of work needs to be done on testing that on other interventions, because this was just what we found with 2, and they did not match an exact trajectory by any means. So I think that there's much more work that needs to be done, and that there's probably a lot of unique findings between these 2 wars and then other wars as well.
Great. So can we expand on the implication or larger contribution of this paper to the literature, or the positioning of this paper to in the existing literature?
Yeah. Well, I think like so much of what we know about counterinsurgencies and military interventions, alliance politics is really important, but it's highly context specific. So just to highlight again the uniqueness of these cases, it's hard to coerce local allies to comply without issuing threats to them, but it's also hard to issue threats to an ally. So when you're trying to work together and when the threats that you're issuing actually harm your partner, that's not great foreign policy.
Yeah.
So, and those are the dynamics that we're thinking about. So it's kind of like it's almost like a warning about how much had to go wrong just to get to this point where you're actually having to withdraw instead of build things together in order to try to coerce a partner. It's not a highly successful foreign policy.
Okay. So let's see what were your limitations. What were the real core limitations in this study?
Yeah. Well, we wanted to look at Afghanistan, but the data, we didn't have great data on public opinion, US public opinion about Afghanistan, and we also didn't have great data on local compliance by the Afghans since the war is ongoing, and the data, and in general, also across the cases we looked at in Iraq and Vietnam as well, the data on public opinion was not as clear as we wanted it to be. We tried to craft reasonable hypotheses and to be clear about the limitations of that data in the paper, just to signal that as a potential limitation in the work.
Yeah. Okay, so how do you think other researchers can navigate these limitations and produce something that makes further contribution to your findings?
Yeah, well, there's a ton of work to be done on this topic, on the effects of withdrawal and threats of withdrawal and actual withdrawal on local politics and interventions. I also think a really interesting front to look at is also the economic implications of withdrawal. We were just looking at this one little piece of the effect of inspiring or pressuring local allies to comply with US policy requests. But first of all, we don't even know if those policy requests were very smart in the first place. It was just what Washington was pressuring local allies to do. We don't even know if that was good counterinsurgency policy to begin with. So it doesn't really say much about winning or losing the war itself. I think there's a lot of work to be done on withdrawal and the idea of winning or losing. It's not that's like, you know, at the end of the day, that's what we really want to measure and know about. And then also on this idea about withdrawal in general being lots of different steps and lots of different stages, and then the economic effects, which I think have very long-standing, profound influences and effects on local communities there. And we haven't really done, I haven't seen a lot of good work done on that. There's interesting work on economics and insurgencies, but it'd be really interesting about the shock of a counterinsurgent intervening and then withdrawing and what that does economically. So I think there's a lot of really good work to be done around this question of withdrawal.
Good. So are you doing anyone on to expand this area? Are you doing any research right now? Are you doing any research right now to expand this area?
Yeah, so there's a bit of work. So the economic question, I'm taking a piece of this with John Askanis, and he's at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. And he and I are working on a paper that will look at what happens, kind of the long-term economic effects of interventions, not necessarily focusing on the withdrawal period, but just on this idea that there's a lot of really good work in comparative politics on corruption. We wanted to look at the ideas about how military intervention itself fuels the corruption that then the interveners claim later, oh, but it was so corrupt we had to withdraw. But so obviously have fed that corruption in profound and important ways. And so we wanted to really look at this idea about where does the money go and how does it alter the economy, and how does that kind of fuel the ecosystem of insurgency and counterinsurgency? Like what are those processes in terms of intervention? Because we feel like there's a lot of scapegoating of local allies, that are put in really difficult situations and really difficult economic conditions, and then are kind of tried to be used by intervening forces, but then are then abandoned. So it's this process I think we really want to look at more in terms of using the literature from comparative politics more carefully in terms of the field within international relations on military intervention.
Great. I hope when you publish the next paper, you get back to us so that we can discuss it here and let other researchers know about your findings also.
Yeah, that'd be great. I would love to know what you think.
We're really, really grateful for joining us in this episode today. Thank you for coming.
Absolutely, Wisdom. Take care. Thank you.
Yeah, please remember to rate us and send your comments through your app. Also, subscribe to this channel and the podcast so that you can receive this program weekly on your devices. You should also reach out to us if you have any recent publications on conflict and terrorism which you would like to discuss on this program. My name is Wisdom Yekikbolo. Join me again next week. Bye for now.